Good evening, everyone. Hello, hello. Welcome to this evening's Fireside chat, sponsored and hosted by the Library Company of Philadelphia. I am Justine Hill Edwards. I'm an associate professor of history at the University of Virginia, and I am so excited to be in conversation this evening with our esteemed guest, Professor Randy Browne, and we will be talking about his new book, which I have here, which I encourage everyone to get: The Driver Story, Labor and Power in the World of Atlantic Slavery. And if you are so inclined, you can actually purchase this book 40% off on the University of Pennsylvania Press website. So I encourage you to do that if you have not gotten a hold of your own copy of this really fascinating and wonderful book that we will be discussing tonight. So, Randy Browne is an award-winning historian of Atlantic slavery who specializes in the British Caribbean. He received his Ph.D. from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and is currently professor of history and director of the first-year seminars at Xavier University in Cincinnati. He is the author of Surviving Slavery in the British Caribbean, which came out in 2017. And that book received the biennial Elsa Goveia Book Prize from the Association of Caribbean Historians. The Driver Story, Labor and Power in the World of Atlantic Slavery, is Randy's latest book. And his scholarship has been supported by grants and fellowships from the Library Company of Philadelphia, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the U.S. Department of Education, and the Huntington Library. We are so excited to have him here. I personally am excited to be in conversation with him this evening. If you have questions that you are hoping to pose at the end of our conversation, please put them in the Q&A. But in the meantime, Randy, thank you for being here, and thank you for writing this really amazing book.
Thanks for the warm welcome, Justine. I'm really been looking forward to this. I want to thank the Library Company as well. Jessica Roney, who directs the program at Early American Economy and Society, for inviting me to do one of these fireside chats. As someone who's been a longtime fan of the Library Company, and on the other side of these, it's exciting to be on this side of the webinar, as it were. And thanks for reading the book and in advance for your questions.
Yeah, no, I'm incredibly excited about chatting with you and getting the opportunity to learn more about your process with this book, what brought you to this book and this topic, and getting into some of the, again, amazing analysis that you do in exploring the history of drivers, a topic that has been surprisingly underexplored by historians. And so to begin, tell us a little bit about how you came to this project of looking at drivers in the Atlantic world.
The idea for this book really came to me kind of inconveniently while I was still trying to finish my first book about 10 years ago. I was actually at the Library Company on a long-term fellowship, and what a treasure that was to be there, living in Cassatt House and working every day in the Library Company, and just kind of ground zero for early American history. That first book was about the struggle enslaved people had to survive in the British Caribbean, and in my research, I kept coming across all kinds of evidence about drivers, different anecdotes, stories, events. And drivers, just for anyone who's joining us who doesn't know, were enslaved people, usually but not always men, who were appointed by white plantation authorities to supervise, to manage, and to punish other enslaved people. And the more I read, the more I came to see that drivers really were at the center of enslaved people's working lives, maybe most obviously, but also their social relationships, and their struggles to both survive and resist slavery. At the same time I was working on my first book, I was reading lots of scholarship on slavery and capitalism, kind of in some ways old field that's been reinvigorated over the past few decades. And it eventually occurred to me that focusing on drivers and on what planners called the driving system offered a way to sort of reconsider the labor regime of Atlantic slavery from the bottom up. So not from the point of view of merchants or planners, but as seen and experienced by enslaved people themselves. So that's kind of what got me interested in drivers. That's what I've tried to do with this book, really understand how people coped with a role that trapped them between the kind of two big forces that we think about in Atlantic slavery, from the top down, the insatiable labor demands of planters to get more and more work out of people. And of course, people who had no incentive to resist, to work, and instead were resisting constantly. And so I wanted to know what it was like to be a driver, how they coped, what it meant to kind of be at the center of what the historian Vincent Browne has described of a never-ending war between enslavers and the enslaved.
Interesting. And so tell us how you connect the work that you did in your first book, Surviving Slavery, to this book about drivers, because it seems like there is a connection there.
Yeah, I mean, there's some connections in the records, which maybe we can talk about later. But I think for me, the real starting point is to recognize um, the demographic catastrophe that was Caribbean slavery, Atlantic slavery, but especially in the Caribbean. Plantations were death traps. Most enslaved people lived, remarkably, distressingly short lives and knew that they had no real chance of becoming free, no matter how hard they tried to resist. And instead, what I at least, argued in that first book was they focused on trying to find ways to get by or survive.
Mhm.
And so that interest in enslaved people's politics of survival intersected with what I was seeing in the evidence about drivers. Um, Becoming a driver rather than a field laborer, right, was one of the single best ways to prolong your life under slavery. And there are a number of different reasons for that. Some of it is simply that drivers weren't doing the real brutal physical labor that sickened and killed so many field laborers. They also got better rations of food and clothing. They had better housing. And it might be easy to say, well, look, these marginal advantages are kind of insignificant. We're talking about people who are trapped on essentially forced labor camps, and that's true. But precisely because this was a world where people were living on the brink of death, um, those marginal advantages had a huge impact on drivers' quality and longevity of their lives. They literally outlived their peers. I found that whereas field laborers were usually dying in their early 40s, if not earlier, drivers regularly lived in their late 50s or 60s. And
Wow.
so that major comparative survival advantage started to help me understand why someone might want to take on the role of a driver, which was otherwise an agonizing and dangerous position, about kind of why people valued the role, why they wanted to stay in it, why they wanted to resist emotion. So I think that's the kind of the connection, at least for me, between my first and second books.
Sure. Well, I wonder, you just mentioned a few minutes ago the ways that the recent scholarship on the intersection of slavery and capitalism influenced both books. Can you talk a little bit more about that in terms of how you're seeing the history of drivers as being a lens through which to understand this intersection between slavery and the rise of capitalism?
Yeah. I mean, as you well know, there's been a ton of, I think, really interesting work over the past couple decades on,
Mhm.
the kind of economic history of slavery, the business history of slavery and the slave trade. A lot of that has kind of re-engaged old debates about the relationship between slavery and capitalism. To my reading, it seems pretty clear that slavery and capitalism were not incompatible at all.
Mhm.
And so I've learned a lot from that work. I think it's really important to understand how slavery worked as a business. Um, at the same time, some of that work at least seems to really center enslavers and merchants. It really is about the strategies that slave traders were using to commodify enslaved people, or the strategies planters and the employees they hired tried to extract wealth. Certainly not true of all this scholarship, but a lot of it doesn't, at least to me, really center the experience of enslaved people themselves. And that's kind of primarily how I've seen my work, what I got interested in. Um, at the same time, there's this older tradition of social and cultural history of enslaved people. It goes back really to John Blassingame and others, in the 1960s, that I continue to, find inspiring and influential. That's really emphasized the different ways enslaved people resisted their enslavers, tried to carve out some measure of autonomy. And what I find interesting is those two, broadly speaking, fields are not always in that much dialogue with each other.
Sure.
Um, and so one of the things I try to do in this book is bring those two approaches together to try to understand what this overarching economic system of Atlantic slavery and racial capitalism looked like on the ground, not in the abstract, but in the messy, often violent, everyday interactions between real people. I found that the driving system was a really good way to do that because it was the primary way that enslavers tried to solve their basic problem of how to extract wealth
Mm.
from people who had no incentive to work for them. And then it was also the place where, drivers were the ones dealing with day-to-day resistance from the bottom up. And so, I mean, it's a little bit, I think, like some of what you're doing in a very different context in your book, in the Freedmen's Bank, where you're trying to weave together these different scales of analysis, where it's not just a
Mm.
top-down history, kind of macro, but it's also not just micro-historical or kind of episodic individually. Hopefully, it's looking at individual people within these larger structures of power.
No, that's fascinating. I think especially in terms of the levels of perspective that you bring to your analysis here, I think is one of the real strengths of the book. So can you talk to us a little bit about sources? Because you have these few pages after the introduction where you talk about sources. What are the sources here? How did you actually go through the archive and really construct your own archive for understanding the lives and experiences of drivers?
Yeah, I mean the I wish I had a more sophisticated research process, but really I was casting the widest net possible, trying to read everything I possibly could about drivers
I
in
think
any
it's a
context.
great process.
Yeah. I mean, it works. It's messy. I don't really know any other way. It was like, anything I could possibly find. But pretty quickly I decided that I was going to focus on this rather unusual archive of legal records from the early 19th century British Caribbean. These are known as records of legal officials who are called fiscals and protectors of slaves. Um, and so I could say a little bit about, I really came to these archives in some ways through the library company and very early in graduate school, even before that. I remember during the summer of my first year in graduate school, I was frankly flailing. Like I was working on, at the time, the transatlantic slave trade to South Carolina, and I was honestly getting bored and frustrated by the evidence I had. The questions I was interested in about enslaved people's own experiences, their voices, what they thought, what they felt, I kept hitting up against what we now I think recognize really clearly as the central silences of the archives, right? All those gaps.
Mm.
Um, and I didn't have a path forward, honestly. And I remember one afternoon, my advisor handed me this thick folder, and he said, "Here, take a look at this, see what you think." And didn't really tell me much what it was. Said I got this document at the library company years ago. I didn't really know what to do, and it turned out that was a transcript of a trial record or trial proceedings from one of these fiscals cases in British Guiana involved an enslaved obeah practitioner and several drivers. It turned out. Who'd been prosecuted for supposedly murdering an enslaved woman in what was really a healing ritual gone wrong. Um,
Mm.
I read that case and reread it over the weekend, and then immediately started trying to, dig deeper and pull that thread, and found that was the tip of the iceberg. It was one of literally thousands of similar cases that are held at the British National Archives. Um, so these records, the protectors' reports, are produced during this period of amelioration, sort of imperial reform and penal reforms, where enslaved people in certain but not all colonies. So we don't have these for Barbados, for Jamaica, but in
Mm.
British Guiana and Trinidad and St. Lucia, enslaved people got new legal rights and they could go and formally complain to these legal authorities. And it kind of shined a bright spotlight on all these other things that were happening. We have like 10,000 pages of testimony that is sometimes near verbatim that survives. So this is incredible archive that
Oh,
that we just don't have most other places here.
yeah.
Um, I used those heavily in my first book, and I ended up using them really heavily in the second one because as much as these records have their own silences and gaps and distortions, I don't want to act like they're transparently telling us exactly what people said and did. Um, they do, though, give us a kind of unusually raw or intimate view of the driving system, where we can
Mm.
get closer to the voices and perspectives of drivers and the other people they interacted with. And so that's kind of the core archive of this project. I've read a bunch of other stuff, abolitionist propaganda, planters manuals, statistical or demographic material, but these records for the types of questions I were interested in ended up being some of the most productive.
No, that's fascinating. I mean, it reminds me of the courts of magistrates and freeholder records in South Carolina, where you get kind of an on the ground glimpse about legal culture in these slave communities, but it kind of illuminates the ways in which the enslaved were kind of interacting legally in ways that we often don't talk about as historians of slavery.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of legal records. I mean, it's one of the few places where enslaved people's voices or fragments of them are sometimes captured. I think
Surprisingly so. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, surprisingly so. Yeah, I mean, we've for very good reasons. I think the field of at least slavery studies have been really focused on the things we don't know, on the silences, on the distortions, and the violence of the archive, and there are good reasons for that. Um, for me, I think that's all the more reason to keep pushing and searching for other types of sources where you do have these archives that really are exceptions to the general rule.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Well, would you say then that in some way you are offering for those of us who are interested in excavating the lived experiences of the enslaved, that legal records are perhaps some of the most kind of illuminating types of archival sources to do that?
They they have been for me because even though I mean these are these legal institutions, despite the kind of the language and the guise of protection, right? It wasn't designed to do that. It's designed to essentially pacify calls for immediate abolition. And so I don't want to make too much of you don't want to be Pollyannish about it, right? There's a lot that's not in these records, and there's a lot where enslaved people have to frame their concerns in a way, right, that's narrowly shaped by has to be some legal violation. At the same time, there's these kind of excesses in the text where they tell you about they might show up to the protector to complain nominally about a particular act of punishment that was illegal. And yet they tell you so many other stories, and then other people come in as witnesses and they tell you other things, and then some scribes recorded more of that than others, and you get the sense that people were just essentially talking once they get that opportunity, having really taken a huge risk to go and challenge their enslavers in court.
Mm,
When those voices are recorded, we just don't see most enslaved people. Like very few people were an Equiano, right, or a
sure.
Mary Prince. Like those are great, and I use literally some of the sources or Solomon Northrop, right? But that's a
Hmm.
tiny minority of people who ended up publishing their own narratives. And so these legal records, where you get a wider view of a larger, more maybe representative population. Yeah, I've been a big fan of them for that reason.
No, that's great. Can you talk to us a little bit about the daily lives of a driver? I mean, you give us such kind of the minutia of their experiences, from their ages to their kind of abilities to create these robust familial structures. So can you talk to us a little bit about what their lives must have been like, or were like, in terms of kind of how they balance both work and their personal lives, so to speak?
Yeah, and you're right to ask. It's a delicate balance because the driver's kind of social role as a leader within the slave community and their
Hmm.
official role as a planter, appointed enforcer of labor discipline. Like there's it's not you don't have to be that sophisticated to see there's a lot of conflict between those two roles.
Hmm.
Um, the day-to-day work that drivers were supposed to do, if you start from kind of the normative what planners expected them to do, the fantasy, right? Planners described the plantation as a machine and said, drivers are the ones charged with making sure that machine works and that no one sabotages that. That's kind of their
Hmm.
metaphor for thinking about the plantation ideal. Now, of course, it never worked that way in practice.
Yeah.
Drivers were responsible for getting people into the field, for reporting anybody who didn't show up. There's a whole ritualization of taking roll and seeing who's there and punishing people who aren't. And then it's the driver's job, essentially, whatever workload for the day, whatever orders were that the plantation manager or the overseer below them said had to
Hmm.
get done, that became the driver's nightmare, essentially, to figure out how to get that done within the limited time he had, right? And then the driver's got really crude tools to do that, right? It's not like, I mean, the drivers didn't have a lot of incentives they could offer the people below them. It's not like they can pay
Hmm.
them, they can offer them privileges, right? So the drivers are really stuck in a world where the main tool that they have at their disposal is violence. Planners expected, encouraged, and really forced drivers to do that. I remember a case, there's a line in Solomon Northup's a memoir, 12 Years a Slave, where he says, I knew when I carried the whip into the field with me that if I didn't use it and the overseer didn't see me using it, there'd be another whip waiting for my back. And so drivers knew that they had to rely primarily on violence. Now, at the same time, drivers weren't just indiscriminately flogging everybody in the field. They knew that would backfire, and so they're trying to cultivate relationships. I found drivers constantly making these decisions throughout the day, trying to exercise discretion. When should they let a certain person who might need to nurse a child leave the field kind of discreetly? When might they turn a blind eye? when might they object to a planner's order and say, you know what, given the conditions, given how tired people are after a particular holiday celebration, given the fact that the field's flooded, hey, this workload's too much. When is it worth going to the manager and trying to object and negotiate? So drivers are making all these really, I mean, I would say day by day, but they're even more than that, like hour by hour decisions about how to best get the work done. That's all just in the workday. After the workday, then they're really wearing other hats of trying to exercise a certain amount of leadership within the slave community. It's not like I've had some people, readers or friends of the year have talked about the project and say, oh, they're like foremen, they're like factory foremen. Yeah, to a certain extent, but drivers don't clock out, right?
Mm,
These are forced labor camps where everybody lives, and so the drivers are living with, they're marrying, they have friends, they have family members and shipmates and kin, sometimes that they're directly supervising and they're living. And so the most successful drivers who remain along tenure are not just kind of going around and throwing their weight around and saying, I'm a driver, I can do this. They're really trying to cultivate a certain amount of legitimacy as a social authority among the slave community. And there are different ways, they do that, which we could talk about.
sure. Well, I mean, I see from the way that you talk about drivers in this book, I mean, they are kind of in the role of middle managers, right? And so in some ways, yes, this book is a major contribution to the history of slavery, Atlantic slavery. But I really see this book as being a contribution to business history and really expanding the way that we think about the plantation complex as a business structure and the various levels of managerial control that we see kind of working in these spaces, and drivers being an important part of that structure.
They're the ground level. They're kind of, yeah, they are junior managers. They're enslaved managers.
Yeah.
Really, I think Caitlin Rosenthal, who wrote a really
Mm-hmm.
fascinating book, Accounting for Slavery, that's doing some similar work on management and the business of
Mm-hmm.
slavery and what that looks like on the ground. Justin Roberts as well. So I think there are other people there, and yeah, it's flattering to hear. I've certainly followed in their footsteps, and yeah, I hope it resonates with people interested in business history as well. Because I mean,
Absolutely.
plantations are such highly organized business. I mean, especially the large Caribbean sugar plantations. They're
Mm-hmm.
complex managerial structures and industrial processing facilities as much as anything else. They're probably the most complicated businesses, certainly in the 18th century. Like way
Mm-hmm.
before we think of the Industrial Revolution, a lot of the dynamics we think about industrial capitalism kind of taking shape on plantations in the Americas.
Sure. Yeah. And so kind of going off of that question, can you talk a little bit about the relationship then between drivers and overseers? Because there seems to be a tension there.
Yeah, and I think probably most Americans are more familiar with the role of the overseer.
Yeah.
Free white person who's supervising laborers on, usually your smaller plantations or your farms. But um, on larger plantations, you had a much more complex managerial structure where so I'll talk about the ones in the Caribbean. My book's, mostly about the Caribbean, where the plantations tended to be a lot larger. You might have anywhere from, 100 to 300 enslaved people or more. Often the owner wouldn't even live on the plantation, sometimes never even saw their land holdings, right? They're what we call absentee owners. And then there'd be a resident manager below them, and then often several overseers.
Mm-hmm.
And so, unlike on kind of a smaller plantation where the overseer would be directly in the field supervising field workers, on these large plantations, the overseer's job really was to make sure the drivers were doing their job. They'd come and micromanage drivers here and there and supervise them in the field, make sure drivers made their reports, usually at midday and the end of the day. But enslaved people would be divided into these different work units or gangs, as they were called under the gang system. Each would have a different driver, and the drivers reported to the overseers. Drivers knew that they were being surveilled one way or another. So even the overseer is literally out of sight. Drivers knew the overseer was going to check on what they were doing.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess, I mean, one thing that's worth emphasizing, if you were an enslaved person on your typical Caribbean plantation, the person you would interact with most closely in terms of managerial structure wouldn't be a white plantation authority. It'd be another enslaved person to be the driver. That's who you'd go to renegotiate a workload, to ask for help, getting a bit more food or rest time. The person who would inflict punishments on you, like that was where you would really meet kind of representative of planter power, at least on the ground level most often.
Mm. And the fascinating part about this is that we are again talking about like a highly organized structure of labor relations. Um, and of course, these structures necessarily involved enslaved women. So can you talk a little bit about how you thought about gender here? Because reading this book, I thought, wow, you are kind of attuned to gender in a really, I think, attentive way, very clear about how the relationship between enslaved men and enslaved women who were drivers were playing out. And so can you talk to us a little bit about how you were thinking about gender as a lens here?
Yeah, I'm glad that came through in your reading. I knew when I started this book that gender dynamics were going to be a big part of the analysis. If for no other reason than the uneven sex ratios of Caribbean plantations, the fact that the biases of white plantation authorities meant that drivers were almost exclusively men. There were female drivers, which I'd like to talk about in a minute. And the fact that field laborers, that were more women working in the field than there were men. And so the gender labor dynamics of plantations were really clear. But there are a couple things that surprised me, frankly. And one was actually that there were more women working as drivers than I had assumed. I, I think I had probably been a little naive in following a lot of other historians, frankly, and reading planter manuals and descriptions that drivers were men. And we're talking about drivers who were supervising adult field laborers. What I found was that there are actually a surprising number of women who worked as drivers, even when they weren't officially recorded. And so, kind of perfect example of this archival silencing where I'd go to look at a plantation inventory where I'd see an enslaved woman recorded as a field laborer, and then in a legal record, she's actually described as a driver.
Hmm.
And so, and I found case after case after like that, where you'd see women actually working as drivers, supervising even enslaved adult men, despite the gender biases. More commonly, though, enslaved women worked as drivers of what were called children's gangs. This was a particularly hard part for me to read about, especially as writing this book when I had a very young child.
Hmm.
Children on plantations were really acculturated to the labor regime by often somewhat elderly enslaved women. So this was a really gendered role given to women who were too old to do the hardest physical labor of the field gang, and their job was to essentially teach enslaved children what it meant to be an enslaved laborer, a sort of perverse
Wow.
apprenticeship into slavery. Planners talked about it as such.
Hmm.
And so, that's enslaved women. Male drivers really had to do with masculinity and how men who became drivers or aspired to be drivers, what they thought about the role and what they got out of it. And I found really useful this Africanist concept that was common both then and now, known as big men or big man politics. Largely a big man was someone who sought what Africanists call wealth and people. So, trying to accumulate a large number of followers, which could be wives and children and other developing other patronage relationships. Um, that concept of the big man helped me understand, in addition to the survival advantage I talked about earlier, why someone would want to be a driver. I found that men who became drivers were way more likely than other enslaved men to be married, that when they were married, they had larger numbers of children than other married enslaved men, and maybe most striking of all, that drivers were really the only men who had multiple wives. Polygamy was something to which African and African descended men in this period aspired to, as part of
Hmm.
a way of accruing wealth and people. There are different reasons drivers were able to do this as a result of their position. It wasn't also only for drivers' family members that they were offering protection and scarce material resources. Drivers really saw their role and were seen by other enslaved people as leaders within the slave community, where they would negotiate for scarce resources. They would try to bring in healers when there was an outbreak of disease, essentially standing up for the people below them. And of course, there's this tension between that role of
Yeah.
a big man, right, which planners didn't really want drivers to be. They needed drivers to have a certain amount of social authority, but not too much that they became too powerful. So drivers were trying to um, someone's walk that tightrope of being both a driver and being a big man at the same time.
Mm. Yeah, can you talk a little bit more about that, like finding that balance between um as a historian, understanding the practical role and the practical experiences of drivers while understanding that in some ways, drivers may have been more or less complicit um, in maintaining this violent labor regime, despite the fact that they themselves were enslaved. How did you balance that?
Yeah, it's tough. And the evidence that survives, right, disproportionately focuses on conflicts, right? I mean, I forget, I really wish you came across this line years ago and I've never been able to find it. Maybe you'll know it. It was another historian who said something about, people don't go to court when things are going well, right? Like, and I'm paraphrasing here. So legal
Mhm.
records capture moments of conflict. And so, and relying mostly
Absolutely.
on those, right?
Yeah.
I've got the kind of normative fantasies that planners had about how the plantation should work.
Hmm.
If you discount that as reality and look at it as ideology, and then you go to legal records to try to understand what was really going on, I think we do probably see more conflict between drivers and other enslaved people, right? Enslaved people complaining about drivers who were unnecessarily severe or abusive, drivers who end up getting demoted for different reasons. And so, in some ways, like the most successful drivers who managed to somehow both convince their enslavers they were doing their best to work people as hard as possible
Mm.
and simultaneously convince the people they supervise that they were really looking out for their interests, right? Like we know the least about them because they don't enter in the record. In terms of violence, though, which you asked about, um, drivers really had no other choice. And if you look at what the drivers have to say about this, they defend their use of violence by saying like, "What do you want me to do?"
Mm.
Had no other option. But even then, drivers often found that having to inflict violence on other enslaved people, including their own family members, they found it deeply distressing and really hard to live with. I remember
Sure.
one case of a guy who actually, a very rare, I should say, who quit, who essentially resigned and told his planters, I can't do this job anymore. He said, all the other people hate me on the plantation. And when he's explaining why, he says it's because I beat them, essentially because I'm doing my job as a driver. Another incident that has always stuck with me involves a man is named Harry. This is on Antigua, shows up in Mary Prince's account. And he goes to church one day with his wife and he begs his wife and his fellow Christians there at church service to forgive him, and
Mm.
explains that he felt awful having to flog his fellow slaves, especially he mentions his wife and his sister, but says that he couldn't risk disobeying the orders of his enslaver because then he would be demoted, which is right akin to a death sentence.
Mm.
And so for me, yes, drivers are, I mean, they're complicit. They're perpetuating the system. They are surviving slavery longer than other people, but the costs they incur in doing that is they are contributing to it, right? They're perpetuating the system. Um,
Sure.
but I really wanted to avoid like an old caricature view of drivers, which just had them as these kind of unthinking, planters' henchmen is really not true. What I found is that the violence at the heart of plantation slavery was deeply damaging for drivers
Mm.
themselves. Um,
Sure.
but I mean, they're on the receiving end of it often. I mean, if we literally like Salma Northrop, right, when they did not extract enough work, when there's some perceived fault, drivers are the one who planners take it out on. Um,
Sure.
and so
Mm.
drivers felt like they didn't have much choice if they wanted to maintain the position.
Sure. Yeah, and I think looking at the experiences of the enslaved through the lives of drivers really underscores that they were both doling out violence, but also the receivers of violence many times as well. And so their lives and experiences really reflect the violence of slavery at this period. And so kind of thinking about that violence as well, can you talk to us a little bit about the work that you do in chapter 4? I was actually really surprised to read about demotion. It was an idea that I had like, wow, I didn't actually kind of think about this. But can you talk to us a little bit about what you do in chapter 4, talking about what happens when a driver is demoted and what that means about kind of this system in general?
Yeah, in general, people who worked as drivers were really invested in that role, and the identity, both because the position came with these, really important material advantages we talked about earlier, and because it helped them create a meaningful social role within the slave community. Like they found it a meaningful position, and planners were not really quick to demote drivers. They knew how disruptive it could be. And so you read their manuals, and this is really borne out by cases of demotion. Like once someone's
Mm.
appointed as a driver, and that took place after enslavers had gotten to know someone and trust them to a certain degree, they were really reticent to demote a driver, except for the kind of most egregious faults, sabotaging production, leading a rebellion, things like this. but of course, drivers did things that got themselves demoted. And so in this chapter, I actually tell a story of one driver got demoted. It was actually unusual in some ways for both the way he got demoted. The guy's named January,
Hmm.
enslaved man, and there are really two key incidents in his story that take place about 10 years apart. It's one of the things I liked about this story is being able to trace January through two different legal records, again, a decade apart. The first was the incident that got him demoted on this coffee plantation where January was a driver. There's this big epidemic. Um, White plantation authorities are either oblivious or incapable of solving it. And so January reaches out to a practitioner of obeah to try to figure out what's going on and solve this problem. Now, that's illegal. And the problem is white plantation authorities find out. They see January as defiant, as a kind of bad driver. They prosecute him, they demote him, they punish him really horrifically. And so, unlike a lot of drivers who get demoted for not getting enough work out of enslaved people or for encouraging them to resist, like January's supposed fault was helping people below him.
Mm,
And the other enslaved people on this plantation responded with gratitude, with loyalty, however you want to think about it. And what that meant is that for decades after January had been stripped of his official title, everybody else on the plantation sees him as a leader still. And
mm,
that lets January continue challenging the overseer, a guy named Boaz, in all these different ways. I mean, really shocking ways that the things that kind of January was able to get away with without getting sold off the plantation, or worse. He goes around telling other people, don't use Mr., don't use an honorific when referring to Boaz. At one point, he even points to Boaz and said, or sorry, he looks at Boaz and he points to the burial ground and he says, soon you're going to be there. And so it's like the most thinly veiled death threat. Boaz seems to tolerate it because he knows, my sense, right, is that he knows cracking down on January even harder is going to lead to rebellion or something like that.
mm,
But then things explode 10 years later. A new owner arrives on the plantation. January stages this massive confrontation. He leads the entire slave population, like 200 people, up to the new owner's door, ostensibly to ask for a dram of rum to welcome the new owner, but really to show everyone that he is in charge. And this, of course, enrages the overseer, who
mm.
storms up and says, what are you doing here? You're not a driver. He orders everybody to drag January away, and no one touches him.
Wow.
Provokes a riot.
Yeah.
Boaz flails and like, I mean, imagine the scene where January's refusing. People rush into the owner's house.
Mm,
Like they're not attacking him, they're just making it really clear that like they're backing January, putting their lives on the line to support this guy who hasn't been a driver for 10 years.
mm,
And so it leads to this days long, labor unrest on the plantation. And so I tell January's story to kind of bookend this chapter on demotion to illustrate two basic things. One, that demoting a driver could be really destabilizing and dangerous, especially when he had broad support from below. Uh,
mm,
and two, that a lot of drivers, or at least some drivers at least, succeeded way more than their enslavers ever wanted them to when it came to becoming authority figures and
mm.
earning the respect of other enslaved people.
Sure. Well, this leads to my next question then, and this is about how you talk about rebellion here. There is a particular chapter 5, where, well, it's entitled a rebellion, where you talk about a rebellion plot in Berbice
Mhm.
in 1813, 1814. Can you talk a little bit about that and how you, one, found those
Yeah.
records? Because from what you've said, it's been under-examined, under-explored in the literature. Can you talk a little bit about that and about the plot in general and how that relates to your discussion of drivers?
Yeah, that was such a gratifying chapter to work on because I thought that this fairly little known rebel conspiracy that I knew involved a lot of drivers
Mm,
um, was going to be a kind of small part of a big synthesis chapter. It was the last one I wrote in the book because I couldn't really figure out how to write it. I knew drivers were really important in rebellions throughout the Americas, both as leaders and as people who betrayed rebel plots. And then it turned out there's hundreds and hundreds of pages of interrogations in the Dutch National Archives. So it's really,
nice.
incredible find. Um, this 1813-14 conspiracy um, was a plot that involved really hundreds or thousands of different enslaved people on a couple dozen plantations who planned to overthrow the colony's white authorities. And what got me really interested in this were these conflicting rather roles that drivers played in it. Um, the first thing I found was that, as with other rebellions throughout the Americas, some of the main organizers were drivers. They were the ones who planned this rebellion, along with other leaders of what were known as diasporic African nations or national groups, like the
Mm,
Coromantese or Congos. At the same time, there were other drivers who played the decisive role in undermining the rebellion by telling white authorities about the plot right before the rebels could attack. So drivers as leaders, drivers as whistleblowers. And then what I found, for me at least more surprising, was that many drivers actually, when confronted with the possibility of a revolt in the making, when these rumors are spreading, when people are approaching them and asking them to lead, they essentially tried to dodge, to borrow a term from Marlene Cars, uh, who they tried to dodge this rebellion. They calculated that the
Mm,
risks of either joining the rebels or betraying them, were both too great, and they just tried to stay out of it. And so this was an opportunity to try to figure out what drivers meant for rebellion and what rebellion meant for drivers.
mm,
Honestly, one of the most interesting things I found when I was reading these interrogations was that the political aspirations of the drivers who did lead the rebellion, their vision rather of what freedom might look like, was really different than what ordinary enslaved people aspired to. And
mm,
what I mean by that more specifically is that the drivers, instead of liberating everyone or abolishing the plantation system, their plan was to simply overthrow white authorities and then run those plantations themselves along with other elite men.
mm,
They imagined a world where a lot of the hierarchies of the plantation system would continue. They would simply be on top rather than being right middle managers, to use your term earlier. They would be on the top, um, and what they referred to as the low class of enslaved people, meaning field laborers, would work for them. They said, "We'll be the officers during the rebellion, you'll be the soldiers, and afterwards you'll work for us." And understandably, like most people weren't willing to get on board with that kind of rebellion, right? Risk their lives for a revolution that didn't
mm,
promise much change. And so for me, looking at this rebellion and Driver's role in it, deepened my understanding of how hard it was to build the kind of solidarities and
sure.
support needed to wage a successful war against slavery, right? You needed a certain amount of broad support and
Mm,
cooperation. Um, but the problem here, the irony was like some of the people best positioned to lead that, right? Drivers who had the mobility, who had the leadership skills, had the social authority, their
mm,
political goals often were in conflict with those of ordinary enslaved people. And so that created
sure.
a problem for everybody.
Sure. And I just want to say on page 140, I read this and I was like, yes, 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 perfect. You say, or you write, the investigation into the 1813-1814 rebel conspiracy also shows us what the enslaved knew all too well, just how hard it was to organize a successful war against slavery. In Berbice and enslaved societies throughout the Americas, rebellions failed for many reasons. Among them, as the evidence from Berbice illustrates, was the fact that enslaved people were often divided on crucial questions of organization, leadership, and political goals. Yeah, I mean, I am going to save that because I think as a teaching tool too, I'm sure you often get students who kind of question why the enslaved didn't stage larger
Yeah, yeah,
scale
yeah, yeah.
rebellions. But I think that paragraph there is a perfect explanation as to perhaps why.
Yeah, I absolutely get that question, right? And I think, frankly, like I started out there, like, why didn't enslaved people? And I think it's easy to think, why didn't people rebel? Why didn't they resist more? And like, I've completely flipped, and I think it's remarkable that given the likelihood of failure, right? Pre-Haitian Revolution, no one's seen a success, right? Like, so it's
Absolutely.
really it's remarkable that they did as often as they did,
Hmm.
given the challenges involved in doing it.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, no, I mean, I think that this is kind of looking at this too through the lens of the experiences of drivers, I think shows just the complexity of the lives of the enslaved, right? The everyday choices that they had to make, the work that you do in your first book talking about survival, but what it kind of meant to stage a large scale rebellion, and then the complicated role of drivers in trying to determine how far they were willing to go to leverage their power and authority or not. Absolutely. Okay, so I am going to um, give up a little bit of time to the questions that we have. The first question that we have, how were drivers selected?
Oh, it's a great question. So, the short answer is that planners look to people who already had a reputation as leaders. Now, they didn't like they weren't looking for the rebel leaders or the people encouraging people to leave to maroon communities or things like that. So
Mhm.
Planner's number one qualification, if you read them, they had a kind of profile of a standard driver. A man in his 30s, late 30s or older, someone who had been kind of in their view seasoned, right? So lived on the plantation or in the particular colony for a long time, and had earned a reputation. They said it needed to be someone who really knew the particular work well. So someone, right, drivers had worked previously almost always in the field, and so needed to know how to cut sugar cane and how to get it to the mill. I mean, whatever, or how to pick coffee or cotton, right? Needed to have the technical expertise. And so there's an intellectual quality as well. And then their next qualification, right, after kind of age and gender and amount of experience, was someone who enslaved people would listen to. They knew that they couldn't appoint someone and just say, this is a driver, listen to him. And so they're very clear that it's got to be someone who is seen as an authority, who is seen as a leader.
Interesting. Um, and our next question, how did drivers fare after slavery finally ended?
God, this is where I wish I knew more about this. I got this question, or I mean, I had this question a lot myself. Part of
Mm,
it, I'm a prisoner of the evidence I have and the types of sources. Like the legal records I have, they stop at the end of slavery. And then trying to follow drivers into freedom, it's really hard
sure.
to see where they individually go. Part of this is just tracing enslaved people's genealogies from slavery through freedom. It's really hard. So I wish I had a better answer, but I don't know as a group. There's a few isolated examples of individual drivers. Some end up where there are workhouses, quote unquote, kind of prisons built. And drivers end up working there. There comes a new driver. Some end up still, right? Plantations don't go anywhere in most places. Once slavery
Mm,
ends, the plantations continue. They continue producing sugar, coffee, cotton. So drivers continue working on them as free people, but they come incredibly hard to trace any individual drivers over time.
sure, sure. Can you talk a little bit more about violence? In particular, I mean, I'm wondering if you had the chance to, or if the sources revealed to you the choices that drivers had to make about inflicting violence was, or the perhaps the psychological toll that may have taken on them. Again, to not just have violence inflicted upon them by white overseers, but to have to inflict violence on members of their communities.
Yeah, I mean, they clearly found that really distressing. And as much as they justify that, as we were talking about earlier, um, I mean, I don't know. This is completely speculative, but I don't know how they truly reconciled that, right? Like being told, self-talk, like I have to do this, telling other people I have to do this, I have no choice. I mean, yeah, they had a choice, right? Within remarkable constraints. Um, and then I think a good example of the kind of cite what at least even abolitionists described as a certain cycle of violence linking planners to drivers to field laborers and then back up is this thing called a tally stick. These were these little
Yeah.
wooden sticks where drivers would carry into the field and they'd mark off, they'd make a scratch or a notch when a certain amount of work got done, try to track it. And they'd turn those tally sticks in during the midday break or at the end of the workday. And there's this ritual inspection of the tally stick to see if enough work got done, right? And when the tally indicator driver fell short, often on the spot, the driver would be forced to strip and lie down, and then suffer violence. There's a particular case where a driver, shows his notch tally to a man to the manager, and the manager says it's not enough, and the driver says, I could get no more. Like you couldn't get more work done. There's no way. It's impossible." And he's probably right. Like the insatiable, and this is capitalism, right? No matter how much work they got done, you get it done one day, they just up the quantity the next day, right? So the driver's got an
Sure.
impossible job, right? Like you can never satisfy it. And so the driver's resigned, and he, strips, and he's flogged by his fellow drivers. Um,
Mm,
there's another case that's really hard for, I remember and was hard to read about, and then write about where a driver is flogged incredibly brutally, and then he walks into the pond to wash his wounds, to wash off. And then he announces that he's going to go back the next day, he's going to go back into the field and he's going to make everyone bleed because he's not going to suffer another flogging,
mm,
for their fault. Um, and so I don't know. It's not like I thought slavery wasn't violent, but reading the material I did for this book just brought me face to face with even more violence and the threat of violence than I really was ever prepared for.
Sure. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about structure? Because
Yeah.
one of the questions that I had after reading the book is one, how you just decided to structure the book, and two, um, if you think that the role of drivers changed over time. Did you see do you see their roles becoming more important or less important as we kind of move through the 18th to the early 19th century?
Yeah, I'll answer the change over time one first um because I'm not sure I have a good answer to that really. My sense is, and as much as I really leaned into this early 19th century record, I was determined to look at the really early origins of the driving system and even precursors to it. 16th century Sao Tome and early 17th century Brazil. So like before we
Mhm.
get the full sugar plantation complex in the Caribbean, before we get the gang system. Um, and there are differences. Plantations get larger, managerial structures change. In the 19th century, you get a much more industrial, or second slavery, as it's sometimes called. And yet the basic dynamics of the driving system and the driver's role were pretty stable across time. I think part of the challenge, or like my failure in having a better answer to that question, is the records for the real early period where we have some version of a driver. We have an enslaved supervisor on these smaller work units. They're so limited that
Mm,
we just don't know a lot about this. We're actually just in conversation with a colleague who works on early Barbados. Says, I think great book. Reviewed it, so I'll see what he really says in the published review. He's saying great book, but I think you're wrong, and you kind of lumped together the origin of the gang system and the origin of the driver, and there were probably drivers before there were gang system. He said, you were kind of misled by following my book. He said, I think I'm wrong too. I said, okay, well, we'll that's why I'm not naming names, but we'll maybe co-author something one day. So I think like that's a mystery exactly how the position
mm,
emerges. Once it's firmly established, kind of mid 18th century, and they're large plantations, I don't think the role changes fundamentally. Um,
mm,
Structure of the book, I knew I wanted to organize it around different aspects of drivers' lives. I knew that in every chapter I wanted to have kind of a triangle structure where the drivers were going to be at the center, but I was looking kind of both up at the white authorities above them and down, as it were, the people they
mm,
supervise. So I was trying to look at that three-part structure everywhere. And then, try to organize the book from um, planners' expectations of what the driving system itself to what drivers' day-to-day work was and how they dealt with this conflicting pressures from above and below. Um, then to shift into the role of drivers as big men and look at their social roles outside the slave community, or I'm sorry,
sure.
outside of labor within the slave community. And then the fourth chapter focuses on demotion, right? How did drivers get demoted? What happened? How did they resist? How did their families respond? And then the rebellion comes last because it's the exact opposite of what planners wanted drivers to do, right? It's the when the driving system breaks down completely, and drivers do the opposite. So we start with a kind of idealized view of how the driving system's supposed to work and how planners try to coerce drivers into the role. The chapter in rebellion is what happens when drivers did the exact opposite and undermine that system they were supposed to make function.
Sure, sure. So we have a question from the audience. You mentioned one instance of how a driver was treated in his or her church, but in general, how did drivers interact with their church? To what extent did the role of driver affect their relationships in their church?
Know very little about that. I see very um, I don't want to suggest that drivers weren't participating in different missionary activities or churches. I just don't see a lot of that. So yeah, I really that's one I'd be completely speculating if I tried to answer. I'm sorry. It's a great
Sure.
question.
Well, I would love to kind of wrap up with getting your kind of final thoughts on what you hope readers take away from this book, both about, well, not both, about slavery,
Yeah.
about the relationship between slavery and capitalism, and perhaps the way that we understand the evolution of slavery in the Atlantic world.
Nice softball to wrap up with. I think it's always hard because you finish a book, right? And then it's like, well, it's out of your hands, right? So people will do with it what they want. But
It's out in the world.
yeah, it's out in the world, right? And like readers are gonna, it stands on its own or it doesn't. But I think at least where I ended up, finishing this book was writing it during a moment when we're reckoning with the consequences of late stage capitalism and the long history and legacies of Atlantic slavery and the intersections between those.
Sure.
And I kept being struck by the different ways that a lot of what we tend to assume is in the far past is still with us. I
Yeah,
think when we look at the driving system, it's really tempting to see driving system, to see plantation slavery, um, as some of the kind of most perverse features of a pre-modern world, or however you want to think of it, right? A world where production relied on brute force, on terror, on creating categories of different categories of people, some of whom were treated as essentially disposable. Um, and it can be comforting to think like those things disappeared after emancipation or after, right, like pick your date. But in reality, I've been struck by the many ways that like the world that I'm writing about in the 18th century, 19th century is a fundamentally modern world. The
yeah,
key features of the driving system, the insatiable demand for more labor, the kind of total disregard for workers' bodies and time, the relentless surveillance and tracking of production of
sure.
what people are
Yeah,
doing,
yeah,
like a
yeah.
lot of that is still with us. And so I ended the book really borrowing a metaphor from the Guyanese historian Walter Rodney, who described the slave trade as capitalism without a loincloth. And I think that applies really well to the driving system as well. For me, it was a way to kind of distill slavery, and capitalism to its kind of starkest form, like its raw essence. So that's what I've tried to do in this book, and I hope it's illuminating and unsettling.
Yeah. No, I think your point about this system of slavery being modern is right on. I mean, I think about Robin Blackburn's work and kind of forcing us to think about modernity in this way, not kind of pushing it aside, but saying, no, this is a very modern system. And what you're showing here, and I said this earlier, I think is a way in which business historians in particular can understand how these structures have this history, and a history that is often not tethered or connected to the history of slavery. Well, thank you so much for being in conversation, for putting this book out into the world, and I wish you much success with having everyone read this. Again, for those of you on this call, please go to the UPenn Press website, buy this book, and get 40% off for the holidays, a gift for yourself or a loved one. And thank you so much, Randy, for being in conversation.
My thanks to you, Justine. This was really, really fun. What a treat.
Thank you so much. Have a good night, everyone.